Cassandra. I am 31 years old, and I have worked at the same regional bank in Savannah, Georgia, for the past 6 years. I have dealt with forged signatures, bounced checks, frantic calls over lost cards, and once, even a man who tried to deposit Monopoly money with a straight face. But through it all, I always thought the worst thing that could ever happen at my job was a robbery. A masked man with a weapon, a note, a trembling hand, a heart-pounding few minutes before the police arrived. That was my threshold for worst day at work. I had no idea that the real nightmare would come in silence, in grief, and in the shape of a widow. It was a regular Tuesday, slow and uneventful. The kind of day where you glance at the clock every 10 minutes, thinking an hour has passed. I was at my station, organizing my drawer, when a man stepped up to my window. He was in his late 50s, tall, and dressed like someone who spent his days in a garage. Grease on his jeans, a faded Braves cap pulled low over his face. He slid a check across the glass and asked me to cash it. I gave him the standard smile, nodded, and picked it up. The amount hit me like a slap. $48,622.95. I blinked. Not because I had never seen a large check before. Business clients cash high amounts all the time. But because this man looked like someone who just came in to deposit $20 for gas. My gut immediately started whispering, so I started the verification process. The check looked clean at first glance. The paper wasn't too thin. The font was correct. The signature was confident. But when I scanned the routing number and account details into our system, everything fell apart. The account number didn't exist. Not even close. It was a near match to one of our closed accounts, one that had been shut down years ago due to fraudulent activity. My fingers froze over the keyboard. I took a breath and looked back at him. I told him calmly that the check was invalid and that it appeared to be fake. His reaction surprised me. He did not argue. He did not shout. He just looked at me, eyes sunken and glassy, and said something about being in a hurry. Then he turned and walked out. I expected him to put up a fight. People usually do when they are caught trying to scam. There is denial, fake outrage, theatrics. But he left without resistance. It was unsettling. Still, I shrugged it off. I made a note of the incident, logged the check, submitted it for fraud review, and moved on. My coworkers joked about it later, how weirdly mellow the guy was. We all forgot about him the next day, until she came in. It was exactly 1 week later, same window, same time of day. I saw the woman before she even stepped up. She was pacing near the glass door, clearly upset, like she had been debating whether to come in at all. Then she stormed up to my window and slammed her palm down on the counter. Her eyes were red, her expression tight with anger. Before I could even ask how I could help her, she accused me of murder. Her voice was loud, sharp. She said I was the reason her husband was dead, that I had refused him the money for his operation, that I had turned him away, knowing full well he was desperate. I was frozen. My mouth hung open, my fingers hovering above the keys. I was not expecting this, not in any possible universe. I asked her who her husband was, and the moment she said his name, my stomach turned to lead. It was the man with the fake check. She said he had a heart condition, that he was scheduled for surgery 2 days after he came to the bank, that the deposit he was trying to cash was from a friend, a payment for work he had done months ago. She said that when I refused the money, he spiraled, that he went home and locked himself in the garage, that by the time she found him, he was unconscious, that he died before the ambulance even arrived. I listened in horror. I remembered the man's eyes, the way he just gave up and walked out. I remembered thinking it was strange. I remembered how sure I had been that the check was fake. I tried to explain that the check he brought was not from a valid account, that it was a close replica of a known fraud case, that I could not cash it because it would have triggered a federal alert. But she did not want to hear it. She said she did not care. She said if I had any humanity, I would have found a way. Then she said something that stuck with me. She said she hoped every night I closed my eyes, I would remember that man's face and wonder if I had let someone die over a piece of paper. And then she turned and walked out the way she came in, leaving behind nothing but a trail of grief and guilt. I took my break early that day. I sat in the back hallway near the vending machines, my hands shaking. I could not focus. Her words circled in my mind like vultures. Had I been too strict? Had I missed something? What if he really was telling the truth? What if the check was good, but looked bad because it was rushed? I could not get the image of him walking away out of my head. When I returned to my station, my manager, Elena, and another teller named Michelle pulled me aside. They had seen the incident. They had listened to the security feed. They told me I had done everything by the book, that the check was absolutely a forgery, that our fraud team confirmed it within hours. They reminded me that I could have lost my job if I had cashed it, that even if his intentions were good, the document was not. Still, none of it made me feel better. I went home that night, made tea, and sat on my back porch, watching the moss sway in the breeze. I could not stop wondering about that man, who his friend was, why he could not get help from anyone else, why he forged the check instead of asking for a loan or going through proper channels. I kept thinking about how fast he gave up, about how the woman looked at me like I had personally killed him. Even though I knew I was right, I could not silence the fear that she might be right too, that maybe what kills people is not always the action itself, but the lack of compassion in systems that treat everyone like a threat until proven otherwise. I do not know if he really needed surgery. I do not know if the check was the only way he thought he could pay for it. All I know is that I did my job, and still, I will never forget his face. Or hers. I have dealt with angry customers before. I have dealt with scammers, fraudsters, and even identity theft. But nothing haunts you like the grief of someone who lost everything and believes you are to blame. Not because you were wrong, but because you could not save someone, even when you were right. And that is something they do not teach you in training. Update 1. I thought the worst part was over once she walked out of the bank that day, leaving me shaken behind the counter. But that was just the beginning. A little over 2 weeks later, I came home from work and found a thick envelope wedged into my apartment mailbox. The kind that instantly makes your stomach drop before you even read the name. It was addressed to me personally. Not the bank, not the branch manager, but me. My hands were already trembling when I tore it open, and the words blurred together before they made sense. I was being sued. She was filing a civil lawsuit against me for wrongful death, emotional distress, and negligence. Seeing my name printed in legal language felt unreal, like I was reading about someone else's life. I sat down on the edge of my couch and read it again, slower this time, my chest tightening with every paragraph. She claimed I had abused my position, that I had deliberately refused to help her husband, that my actions directly led to his death. It did not matter that I worked under federal banking regulations, that I had no discretion in cases of fraud. On paper, it looked like a grieving widow versus a faceless institution represented by one unlucky teller. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside my apartment made me jump. I kept imagining courtrooms, judges, my name dragged through public records, headlines I never asked for. The next morning, I went straight to my manager's office before my shift even started. She had already heard. The bank's legal department had been notified the moment the lawsuit was filed, and they immediately reassured me that I would not be facing this alone. Still, reassurance only goes so far when your name is the one on the papers. Within days, I hired my own lawyer as well, a quiet, sharp woman based in downtown Savannah who specialized in financial liability cases. Sitting in her office, surrounded by shelves of law books and framed certificates, I felt smaller than I ever had. She went through the lawsuit line by line, pointing out where the claims did not align with banking law, where emotional accusations were being used instead of facts. She told me the case was weak, that it leaned heavily on grief rather than evidence. I nodded, listened, took notes, but my heart refused to slow down. Back at work, my colleagues closed ranks around me in a way I will never forget. Michelle helped me pull archived system logs from the day the man came in. Elena printed out transaction verification timestamps, routing number mismatch reports, fraud alerts triggered by the check scan. Our fraud department compiled a full report showing that the check had been part of a known forgery pattern circulating across southern Georgia and northern Florida. There were records showing that if I had cashed it, the bank would have flagged the transaction within minutes and frozen the funds, possibly even opening a criminal investigation against the man himself. They showed me everything, step by step, screen by screen, proof that I had followed protocol perfectly. Proof that I had protected the bank, my job, and technically even the man from committing a federal crime. My lawyer reviewed it all and told me again that I had done nothing wrong, that legally, ethically, professionally, I was in the clear. And yet, none of it erased the knot in my chest. I started losing weight without trying. At first, I thought it was stress nausea or just skipped meals, but after a week, my jeans felt loose. By the end of the second week, the scale showed I was down 3 kilograms. Food tasted like nothing. My stomach clenched every time my phone buzzed, every time an unfamiliar car slowed near my building. Even after everyone around me laid out the facts, my mind kept circling back to the same place. A man walked into my bank needing money. A man walked out empty-handed. A week later, he was dead. I kept replaying the moment he turned away from my window, the way his shoulders sagged. I wondered if I could have said something different, softer, more human. I wondered if there was another option I should have offered, another department I could have sent him to, even though policy said otherwise. My colleagues reminded me again and again that compassion does not override the law, that systems exist for a reason. I believed them. I trusted them. I saw the proof with my own eyes. But fear does not care about proof. Even knowing I was not guilty, even watching my lawyer confidently prepare the defense, Even having an entire institution behind me, I could not shake the feeling that something terrible had attached itself to my life. I went through my days on autopilot, smiling at customers, processing deposits, doing everything right while feeling like the ground beneath me was unstable. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling, my body exhausted, but my mind refusing to rest. The evidence said I was innocent. The law said I was protected. Everyone around me said I was safe. And still, I had never been so scared in my life. Update 2. By the time the court date arrived, my body felt like it had been wrung out and hung to dry. I walked up the steps of the Chatham County Courthouse with my hands shaking so badly I had to lace my fingers together just to keep them still. The building looked imposing that morning, all stone and authority, and every step echoed louder than it should have. I kept thinking that this was where everything I had worked for could collapse. Not because I did something wrong, but because someone decided to turn grief into a weapon. Inside the courtroom, everything felt unreal. The benches, the flags, the quiet murmur of people waiting for their lives to be discussed, like paperwork. I sat beside my lawyer, staring straight ahead, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Across the room sat the woman who had screamed at me weeks earlier. She looked composed now, dressed carefully, eyes downcast, in a way that felt practiced. Seeing her again made my stomach twist, and for a brief moment, all that fear came rushing back. The sleepless nights, the weight loss, the constant feeling that I was about to be punished for something I did not do. The hearing moved faster than I expected. Evidence was presented. Logs, reports, timestamps, internal fraud alerts, federal compliance rules. Everything my colleagues had helped me collect was laid out cleanly and methodically. It became clear very quickly that this case was not built on facts, but on emotion. The check was proven fake beyond any doubt. The system flags were undeniable. The procedures I followed were mandatory, not optional. There was no discretion, no alternative path I could have taken without breaking the law. When the judge ruled in my favor, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked the air out of my lungs. It was over. I had won. The lawsuit was dismissed. My name was cleared. I sat there, stunned, as if my brain could not catch up to my body. For the first time in weeks, my shoulders dropped. I remember thinking that I could finally breathe again, that I could go home and sleep without waking up in panic. That feeling lasted only minutes. As we left the courtroom, she approached us, her expression changing rapidly. Gone was the subdued, grieving widow image. In its place was irritation, sharp and bitter. She started speaking fast, her words spilling out without the careful filter she had maintained inside. She said that if it were not for my colleagues backing me up, I would have lost morally, that I would have folded under pressure and handed over the money. What caught me off guard was not the accusation itself, but the wording. She did not say I would have given the money to her. She said I would have given all the money to them. That single word hit me harder than anything else that day. Them. In that instant, something clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The rushed exit of her husband, the immediate accusations, the emotional ambush at my workplace, the lawsuit aimed directly at me instead of the bank, the way the case leaned heavily on guilt rather than evidence. It all lined up. This was never about justice. It was about pressure, about intimidation, about pushing me into a corner emotionally until I broke and paid just to make it stop. I stood there, stunned, as the realization sank in. This was a scam. A long, calculated attempt to exploit my fear, my empathy, my sense of responsibility. Whether her husband truly needed surgery or not no longer mattered in that moment. The forged check, the lawsuit, the courtroom performance, all of it pointed to a coordinated effort to extract money from me personally. They had counted on me being alone, overwhelmed, and willing to sacrifice myself to escape the guilt. Instead, my colleagues had intervened. The bank had stood by me. The paper trail had saved me. The anger came later, slow and burning. It crept in after the adrenaline wore off, after I got home and sat in silence. I looked at myself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. My face was thinner, my eyes sunken, my clothes hanging loosely from a body that had shed 3 kilograms under the weight of stress and fear. Weeks of sleepless nights, skipped meals, constant dread, all because someone decided to turn deception into a weapon and aimed it straight at me. I was furious, not just at them, but at the situation itself. Furious that I had suffered so deeply over something built on lies. Furious that my body had paid the price. Furious that I had doubted myself, replayed every decision, punished myself internally for doing my job correctly. The fear had been real. The physical toll had been real. And in the end, it was all a manipulation designed to make me hand over money out of guilt. Walking out of that courtroom cleared my name, but it also stripped away any remaining softness I had about what happened. I did not just survive a lawsuit. I survived an attempt to break me emotionally and financially. And knowing that my suffering came from deception, not truth, left me angrier than I had ever been in my life. Update 3. The morning after the trial, I arrived at the bank before sunrise. I parked my car under the same flickering streetlight I had passed 1,000 times. But that morning, everything felt different. The city was quiet, the air still heavy with dew, and for the first time in weeks, I walked through the bank's glass doors with my head high and my chest open. I had won. Not just the court case, but my dignity, my sanity, my name, but something still clawed at the back of my mind. Their words, that slip, them, that smug final attempt to tell me I had only survived because others stepped in. The idea that they still believed they could outsmart everyone if they just kept pushing. It stuck to me like a splinter I could not pull out. And as I sat at my terminal, sipping coffee and listening to the soft hum of the servers come to life, I made a decision. I typed in their names. We had access to flagged accounts and internal notes through a back-end system that compiled patterns of unusual financial activity. I remembered the name on the forged check. I remembered the surname on the lawsuit. And when I cross-referenced both names through our fraud monitoring system, what I found made my blood run cold. There had been other attempts, small, strange transactions, checks issued and voided within minutes, multiple accounts linked to the same address with different last names, bank-to-bank transfers that triggered fraud alerts but never completed. They had not just targeted me. They had tested the system before. I flagged the accounts manually and submitted them to our fraud team with a summary of the entire situation, including the lawsuit and trial outcome. I attached the court's ruling, internal documentation, and the transaction logs from the day the forged check came in. Within hours, The response came through. With approval from our branch director, the bank locked the accounts temporarily under the classification unusual operations pending investigation. It meant their funds were frozen. No withdrawals, no transfers, no activity, and the best part? Because of the pattern of behavior in the lawsuit on public record, the bank had the authority to hold the assets for up to 45 days while the fraud team completed their inquiry. That was when the real performance began. 3 days later, they walked into the bank together. The woman who had sued me and the man whose forged check had started everything. He looked healthier than I remembered. No signs of the supposed heart condition that had formed the core of their story. She looked furious, lips pressed tight, eyes scanning every desk until they locked on mine. I was at my window, calmly processing a deposit for an elderly client, but I felt the air change the moment they stepped inside. They marched straight to me and asked why their accounts were frozen. I did not even flinch. I slid the drawer closed, picked up the laminated sign that said, "On break," and gently placed it on the counter. Then I stood up and walked to the back of the office without a word. Elena was watching from her desk. Michelle was at the adjacent window. Without hesitation, they both placed the same sign in their own windows and stood up. The others followed suit. Within 30 seconds, every customer-facing employee in the building was off the floor. It was the most coordinated, silent protest I had ever witnessed. The director had given us permission that morning. If they showed up, we were not to engage directly. The fraud team had our backs, and the legal department had ruled that until the review was complete, we had no obligation to discuss anything beyond the standard notification they had already received in writing. So we let them stand there, confused, angry, powerless, surrounded by customers who now looked at them like they were radioactive. They returned again the next week, quieter this time, asking for someone, anyone, to speak with them. They were told the accounts remained under review and that they would receive updates in writing. By the third week, their visits turned into phone calls, then emails, then silence. By the time the fourth week ended, they came back one last time. They walked straight to my window. I was processing wire transfers that day, deep in a stack of corporate documentation, but I looked up the moment they approached. They both looked different now, exhausted, deflated. Whatever bluff they had been riding had run out of steam. And then, in a voice far more fragile than I expected, she apologized. Not just for the lawsuit, for everything, the lies, the setup, the check, the pressure. I listened. I let her speak. I said nothing. Then I forwarded a request to the fraud team to lift the freeze. 2 days later, their funds were unfrozen. They returned quietly, signed the necessary forms, withdrew the entirety of their accounts, and requested immediate closure. We handed them the balance in a cashier's check, provided the termination receipts, and watched them leave without another word. I never saw them again, but I kept the printout of the account flag request in my drawer, the one that bore my name and the approval stamp, proof that the system worked, that doing the right thing does not always leave you empty-handed. They thought they could manipulate guilt. They thought they could weaponize grief and push me into submission. Instead, they were forced to stand in front of the very person they tried to destroy and admit defeat. And as I sat there at my terminal, 10 pounds lighter, still recovering from the storm they dragged me through, I realized something that stayed with me. The worst part had never been the lawsuit. It had been doubting myself, losing sleep over a lie so rehearsed it almost felt true, letting fear chew away at my mind and my body until I could not even recognize the girl in the mirror. But in the end, they had to come back. They had to look me in the eyes. They had to say the words. And that apology, that quiet moment of reckoning, was mine. They left the bank. I stayed. And that was the final answer.